Close your eyes for a moment and imagine waking up in ancient Rome, not as an emperor, not as a senator, but as an ordinary person whose name history never recorded. No marble palace surrounds you, no servants wait at your door. Instead, you wake to the low hum of a city already alive, long before the sun has fully risen. This was Rome for most people. When we think of ancient Rome, we often picture grand arenas, mighty legions, and powerful rulers, but those images tell only a small part of the story. The true Rome was built and sustained by millions of ordinary men, women, and children who lived modest lives filled with routine, struggle, and quiet resilience. The world was noisy, crowded, and unpredictable, yet deeply human. For the average Roman, the day began early, whether they wished it or not. The city itself acted as an alarm clock, the creak of wooden carts rolling over stone streets, the distant calls of vendors setting up their stalls, and the shouts of neighbors echoed through thin walls. Sleep was light and easily broken. Most people lived in apartment buildings called insulae, stacked several stories high and packed tightly together. Entire families often shared a single room, sleeping on simple mats or wooden frames. These buildings were not designed for comfort. Fires were common, and collapse was a constant fear. The higher up you lived, the cheaper the rent, and the more dangerous your situation. Many Romans woke each day grateful not for luxury, but simply for safety. Survival itself was something to be thankful for. Morning routines were simple and practical. There was little time for leisure. Washing involved a small bowl of water if one was available, or a quick visit to a public fountain. Running water inside homes was rare, even in Rome, despite its famous aqueducts. Instead, people carried heavy jars from fountains scattered throughout the city. These fountains became social hubs. Neighbors greeted one another, exchanged news, and shared rumors as water flowed endlessly from stone spouts. Breakfast was modest. A piece of bread was the most common meal, sometimes dipped in wine or olive oil to make it easier to eat. Porridge made from grain was another staple. Meat was a luxury few could afford regularly. Hunger was familiar, especially for the poor. Many families depended on state-distributed grain to survive, and when supplies were delayed or reduced, anxiety spread quickly as the morning progressed. Rome grew louder and more crowded. Shops opened directly onto the streets, their interiors visible to passers-by. Bakers sold fresh loaves, filling the air with comforting smells. Barbers shaved customers in public view, their conversations drifting into the street. Blacksmiths hammered metal, tailors stitched garments, and merchants shouted prices to attract attention. Work in Rome was not hidden, it was on display everywhere. Most ordinary Romans worked long hours at physically demanding jobs. Porters carried heavy loads across the city. Laborers repaired roads and buildings. Dock workers hauled goods from ships along the Tiber River. Craftsmen spent their days shaping clay, leather, or wood into useful objects. Slaves formed a significant part of the workforce, yet many free citizens lived lives just as exhausting and uncertain. Women's daily lives often centered on the household, but this did not mean idleness. They prepared meals, managed children, cleaned living spaces, and handled countless small tasks essential to survival. Many also worked outside the home, especially in poorer families. Some sold goods, assisted in shops, or produced items for trade. Their labor was constant and rarely acknowledged, yet without it, daily life would have collapsed. Children grew up quickly in Rome. Childhood was short and fragile. Many learned trades by watching their parents, helping with tasks as soon as they were able. Formal education existed, but only families with enough resources could afford it. Even then, schooling was simple and strict. For many children, work began early, and responsibility arrived long before comfort. By midday, the Roman sun became relentless. Stone buildings absorbed heat, and narrow streets trapped it, turning the city into a furnace. Whenever possible, people sought shade or slowed their pace. Some paused briefly to rest. Others had no choice but to continue working, sweat-soaked and exhausted. Life did not pause for heat. Food at midday was usually no more elaborate than breakfast. Leftover bread, fruit, or small portions of vegetables were common. Wealthier Romans might enjoy a warm meal, but for most, eating was about sustenance, not pleasure. Still, meals were moments of connection, times to sit, talk, and briefly escape the pressures of the day. Public baths offered one of the few forms of relief available to ordinary Romans. These were not merely places to wash, They were social centers. For a small fee, people could bathe, relax, and socialize. The baths were warm, noisy, and crowded, filled with conversation and laughter. Here, social barriers softened. Rich and poor, free and enslaved, often shared the same spaces, if not the same status. As afternoon faded into evening, the city shifted once again. Shops closed, work slowed, and people returned home carrying whatever food or goods they had managed to secure. Streets remained busy, lit by oil lamps and filled with voices. Rome never truly slept, but it did soften. Dinner was usually the main meal of the day, though still simple for most. Bread, vegetables, and occasionally fish or meat-filled bowls shared among family members. There were no dining rooms for the poor, no reclining couches, just small spaces and tired bodies, yet these moments mattered. Stories were shared, children listened, life continued. As night fell, danger increased. Poor lighting, crime, and fire were constant threats. Many Romans avoided unnecessary travel after dark, doors were bolted, lamps dimmed, and families settled into rest. Tomorrow will bring the same challenges, the same routines, the same quiet endurance. This was the rhythm of ordinary Roman life, not glorious, not easy, but deeply real. An empire does not survive on marble and gold alone. It survives on the daily effort of people who wake, work, eat, and sleep without applause. These were the Romans who truly built Rome. For the ordinary Roman, work was not a choice or a passion, it was a necessity tied directly to survival. There was no concept of weekends, no paid leave, and no guarantee of stability. Each day brought uncertainty, and every job carried risk. Yet, through this relentless labor, Rome functioned. Most Romans did not work for wages in the modern sense. Many were paid daily, if at all. If illness, injury, or bad luck struck, income vanished instantly. This made life fragile. A single missed day of work could mean hunger for an entire family. As a result, people worked even when sick, exhausted, or injured. Street labor defined much of Rome's economy. Porters hauled heavy sacks of grain, stone, or merchandise across uneven streets. Builders repaired walls, roads, and aqueducts under harsh conditions. Waste collectors removed refuse from crowded neighborhoods, a necessary but unpleasant job that kept disease at bay. These workers were visible everywhere, their bodies shaped by years of strain. Skilled trades offered slightly better prospects but still demanded long hours. Shoemakers, carpenters, metalworkers, and potters worked in small workshops that opened directly onto the street. Customers could watch items being made in real time. These artisans took pride in their craft, but profit margins were slim. Competition was fierce, and failure meant poverty. Women's labor was just as essential, though often overlooked. In poorer households, women worked relentlessly. They cooked, cleaned, fetched water, cared for children, and managed household finances. Many also worked outside the home, spinning wool, weaving cloth, selling food, or assisting in family businesses. Widows and unmarried women often supported themselves entirely through labor, navigating a world that offered little protection. Slavery formed the backbone of Roman society, and its presence shaped the lives of free citizens as well. Slaves worked in homes, workshops, fields, and mines. Some were treated harshly, others lived relatively stable lives, but none were free. Their existence reminded free Romans of both privilege and vulnerability. Many feared falling into debt or disgrace, knowing slavery was not always distant. Despite constant work, social life still existed, though it looked very different from modern leisure. Romans socialized in public spaces rather than private homes. Taverns, street corners, markets, and bathhouses were places where people talked, argued, laughed, and exchanged news. Gossip traveled fast in Rome, and information spread through conversation long before written notices. Taverns were particularly important for the working class. These were not elegant establishments but simple rooms with wooden benches, clay cups, and loud voices. Wine flowed freely, often diluted with water. Food was basic but filling. For many, taverns offered warmth, company, and a brief escape from hardship. They were places of storytelling, joking, and shared frustration. Religion played a constant role in daily life. Ordinary Romans did not see faith as separate from routine. Small household shrines honored protective spirits, ancestors, and local gods. Before work, meals, or travel, simple prayers were offered. These rituals were not dramatic, they were habitual, woven into everyday actions. Public religious festivals were moments of relief and excitement, streets filled with processions, music, and sacrifices. Work slowed or stopped entirely. For a brief time, social divisions softened as people gathered to celebrate together. These festivals provided emotional release and reinforced a sense of belonging within the vast empire. Yet life was never free from fear. Disease spread quickly in crowded conditions. There was little understanding of sanitation or infection. A minor wound could turn fatal. Plague swept through cities periodically, killing thousands without warning. Medical care existed, but it was limited, expensive, and often ineffective. Fire was another constant threat. Open flames were used for cooking, heating, and lighting. In tightly packed neighborhoods, a single spark could destroy entire blocks. When fires broke out, people fled with whatever they could carry. Fire brigades existed, but response was slow. Many families lost everything in a single night. Crime also shaped daily behavior. Theft, assault, and fraud were common, especially after dark. Law enforcement was inconsistent, and justice often favored the wealthy. Ordinary Romans learned to be cautious, relying on community networks for protection rather than institutions. Despite these hardships, Romans found meaning in relationships. Family bonds were central. Even in poverty, families shared responsibilities and protected one another. Parents invested deeply in their children, hoping they might achieve better lives. Marriage was often practical rather than romantic, but affection grew through shared struggle. Friendship mattered deeply. Neighbors relied on one another for support, information, and survival. Borrowing food, sharing tools, or watching children was common. In a world with few safety nets, people became each other's protection. Entertainment, though limited, existed everywhere. Street performers entertained crowds with music, juggling, or storytelling. People gathered to watch chariot races, gladiator games, or public spectacles when possible. These events offered emotional intensity, fear, excitement, or breaking the monotony of daily life. As evening approached, exhaustion settled in, muscles ached, hands were calloused, minds were heavy with worry about tomorrow. Yet there was also familiarity. Rome was harsh, but it was home. Its rhythms, sounds, and struggles were known. Ordinary Romans did not dream of changing the world. They dreamed of stability, steady work, enough food, healthy children, and a safe night's sleep. Their ambitions were modest because survival demanded humility. Through their labor, their endurance, and their quiet persistence, they sustained one of the greatest empires in history. Not through glory or conquest, but through everyday effort repeated endlessly, day after day. For most ordinary Romans, life unfolded within small, crowded living spaces that offered little comfort and almost no privacy. The idea of a peaceful home was a luxury enjoyed only by the wealthy. For everyone else, home was simply shelter, a place to sleep, store a few possessions, and escape the noise of the streets for a few hours each night. The majority of Rome's population lived in apartment buildings known as insulae. These structures rose several stories high and were packed tightly together. Built quickly and cheaply, many were unstable, poorly ventilated, and dangerously prone to collapse. The lower floors were often occupied by shopkeepers or slightly wealthier tenants, while the poorest residents lived higher up, climbing long staircases each day just to reach their rooms. Inside these apartments, space was extremely limited. A family might live, eat, sleep, and work in a single room. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a wooden bed, a small table, and a chest for belongings. Windows were small or non-existent, leaving rooms dark and smoky. In summer, heat became unbearable. In winter, cold seeped through thin walls. Cooking indoors was risky and often forbidden because of fire hazards. As a result, many families did not cook at home at all. Instead, they relied on street food and small eateries called thermopolia. These were scattered throughout the city, recognizable by large jars embedded in counters, filled with hot meals ready to serve. Food for ordinary Romans was simple and repetitive. Bread formed the foundation of most meals. Grain was cheap and widely distributed, especially in Rome itself, where the government provided free or subsidized grain to citizens. Bread was eaten at every meal, often dipped in wine, broth, or oil to make it more filling. Vegetables such as beans, lentils, cabbage, onions, and garlic were common. Meat was rare for the poor and usually eaten only during festivals or special occasions. Fish, when available, was more common than meat, though fresh fish was expensive. Salted or dried fish instead. Wine was a daily drink, but it was very different from modern wine. It was usually diluted with water and often of low quality. Even children drank diluted wine, as clean drinking water was not always reliable. Water came from public fountains, and fetching it was a daily chore, often assigned to women or children. Meals were not elaborate social events for ordinary families. They were practical moments, focused on sustenance rather than pleasure. People ate when they could, not according to strict schedules. Hunger was a constant presence, shaping daily decisions and moods. Despite these hardships, Romans placed great importance on routine. Daily habits created a sense of order in an unpredictable world. Morning began early, often at dawn. Streets filled quickly with workers, merchants, animals, and carts. Noise was constant, shouting, hammering, wheels scraping stone. Bathing was one of the few comforts shared across social classes. Public bathhouses were central to Roman life and accessible even to the poor for a small fee. These baths were not just places to wash, they were social hubs. People talked, argued, relaxed, and exchanged news while bathing. For ordinary Romans, visiting the baths was both practical and psychological. Warm water eased aching muscles after long days of labor. Cleanliness offered dignity in a world that often stripped it away. The baths provided a rare space where social divisions blurred, if only temporarily. Children's lives reflected the realities of their parents' status. Childhood was short. From a young age, children were expected to help with work, whether assisting in shops, caring for siblings, or learning a trade. Formal education was limited and usually reserved for wealthier families. Play existed, but it was woven into daily life rather than separated from it. Children played with simple toys, dolls, balls, carved animals, or invented games using stones and sticks. Laughter echoed through alleys, reminding adults of the lighter side of life. Even in difficult conditions, health remained a constant concern. Poor nutrition, overcrowding, and lack of sanitation made illness common. There was little understanding of germs or infection. Home remedies were widely used, combining herbs, superstition, and prayer. Doctors existed, but many people could not afford them or distrusted their methods. Sleep offered little relief. Apartments were noisy, hot, and uncomfortable. Beds were often shared. Mattresses were stuffed with straw or wool, attracting insects. Nighttime brought its own dangers. Crime, fire, and structural collapse were real threats. Still, exhaustion ensured most people slept deeply when they could. Evenings were quieter but never silent. Lamps flickered in windows. Voices drifted from taverns. Somewhere nearby, music or laughter might rise briefly before fading again. Rome never truly slept, but it did slow. Within these routines, people found moments of contentment, a shared meal, a successful day's work, a child's laughter. These small victories mattered deeply. They gave meaning to lives otherwise defined by struggle. Ordinary Romans did not write histories or command legions, but their lives formed the foundation of the empire. Through cooking, cleaning, raising children, and maintaining routines, they sustained a civilization that would endure for centuries. Their homes may have been small, their food simple, and their lives hard, but their resilience was immense. In these quiet rhythms, the baking of bread, the drawing of water, the walk to the baths, Rome truly lived. For most ordinary Romans, life was shaped not by emperors or grand monuments, but by work. Work determined where one lived, what one ate, and how much rest one was allowed. The rhythm of the city followed the rhythm of labor. From the first light of dawn to the fading glow of oil lamps at night, the majority of Rome's population belonged to the lower classes: artisans, shopkeepers, porters, builders, street vendors, and laborers. These people lived by their hands. There was no concept of weekends or retirement. If a person could work, they were expected to do so, regardless of age or exhaustion. Many Romans worked in small workshops attached to their homes. A shoemaker might live above his shop, the smell of leather always clinging to the air. A potter's hands were permanently stained with clay. Bakers woke long before sunrise to prepare bread for the city, their ovens burning hot while the streets outside were still dark and quiet. Others worked outdoors. Construction laborers hauled stone and timber through narrow streets, sweating beneath the Mediterranean sun. Dock workers unloaded grain ships at the ports, their backs bent under heavy sacks that fed the city. Street vendors called out endlessly, selling fruit, nuts, hat food, or cheap wine to passers-by. Payment was often small and uncertain. A single bad day, illness, injury, or lack of customers, could mean hunger. There were no savings accounts, no safety nets. Many families lived one day at a time, hoping tomorrow would bring enough work to survive. Social class shaped everything. Wealthy Romans rarely worked with their hands. They owned land, businesses, or slaves who labored on their behalf. Ordinary citizens, by contrast, shared cramped spaces, long hours, and constant pressure. The gap between rich and poor was vast and always visible. Housing reflected this divide sharply. The poor lived in insularly, tall apartment buildings packed tightly together. These structures were often poorly built, with wooden beams, narrow staircases, and little ventilation. Fires were common, and collapses were feared. Families crowded into single rooms, sometimes sharing space with neighbors or relatives. Water was not always available inside these buildings. Many residents fetched water from public fountains, carrying heavy jars up flights of stairs. Waste disposal was primitive, and the smell of daily life lingered constantly. Privacy was rare, noise was constant. Yet within these walls, families cooked, slept, argued, laughed, and survived. Despite hardship, Romans found small comforts wherever they could. Food, though simple, was deeply valued. Bread was the foundation of every meal. It was eaten with olives, cheese, beans, or porridge. Meat was rare for the poor, usually reserved for festivals or special occasions. Wine, however, was common. Even children drank it, though it was watered down. Taverns dotted the city, offering cheap food, drink, and company. These spaces were loud and lively, filled with dice games, gossip, and laughter. For a short while, worries could be forgotten. Community mattered. Neighbors relied on one another for support, sharing food, news, and protection. Religious rituals, festivals, and public games gave people moments of escape. On festival days, the city transformed. Streets filled with music, incense, and processions. Temples overflowed with worshippers seeking favor from the gods. Religion was woven into daily life. Ordinary Romans prayed often, not in grand ceremonies, but in quiet moments. They prayed for health, for work, for safe childbirth, for protection from fire or illness. Small household shrines honored family spirits, offering a sense of continuity and hope. Slavery was an unavoidable part of this world. Many households owned slaves, even modest ones. Slaves worked alongside free citizens, performing similar tasks but without freedom or security. Their lives depended entirely on their owners. Some were treated kindly, others suffered harsh punishment. Freedom was possible, but never guaranteed. For women, daily life was demanding and largely invisible. They managed households, prepared food, raised children, and often assisted in family businesses. Poor women worked just as hard as men, selling goods, weaving cloth, or serving in taverns. Their labor was essential, though rarely recognized. Children grew up quickly. From a young age, they helped with chores or learned trades. Formal education was limited for the poor. Survival mattered more than schooling. Play existed, but responsibility came early. Childhood was brief. Health was fragile. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatment depended on herbs, prayers, or crude surgery. Disease spread easily in crowded conditions. Many did not live long lives. Death was familiar, present in every neighborhood, every family. Yet Romans were resilient. They adapted. They endured. They found meaning in routine and community. They laughed, argued, celebrated, and mourned together. Life was hard, but it was lived fully. At night, the city softened. Work ended. Lamps flickered in windows. Voices lowered. The noise faded into distant murmurs. Families gathered to eat, talk, and rest. Tomorrow will bring the same struggles, but also the same chances. This was the reality of ordinary Roman life, not marble statues and triumphs, but sweat, noise, hope, and endurance. A world built not only by emperors, but by millions of unnamed people who carried Rome forward day by day. For most ordinary Romans, life was shaped not by emperors or grand monuments, but by work. Work determined where one lived, what one ate, and how much rest one was allowed. The rhythm of the city followed the rhythm of labor, from the first light of dawn to the fading glow of oil lamps at night. The majority of Rome's population belonged to the lower classes: artisans, shopkeepers, porters, builders, street vendors, and laborers. These people lived by their hands. There was no concept of weekends or retirement. If a person could work, they were expected to do so, regardless of age or exhaustion. Many Romans worked in small workshops attached to their homes. A shoemaker might live above his shop, the smell of leather always clinging to the air. A potter's hands were permanently stained with clay. Bakers woke long before sunrise to prepare bread for the city, their ovens burning hot while the streets outside were still dark and quiet. Others worked outdoors. Construction laborers hauled stone and timber through narrow streets, sweating beneath the Mediterranean sun. Dock workers unloaded grain ships at the ports, their backs bent under heavy sacks that fed the city. Street vendors called out endlessly, selling fruit, nuts, hat food, or cheap wine to passers-by. Payment was often small and uncertain. A single bad day, illness, injury, or lack of customers, could mean hunger. There were no savings accounts, no safety nets. Many families lived one day at a time, hoping tomorrow would bring enough work to survive. Social class shaped everything. Wealthy Romans rarely worked with their hands. They owned land, businesses, or slaves who labored on their behalf. Ordinary citizens, by contrast, shared cramped spaces, long hours, and constant pressure. The gap between rich and poor was vast and always visible. Housing reflected this divide sharply. The poor lived in insulally, tall apartment buildings packed tightly together. These structures were often poorly built, with wooden beams, narrow staircases, and little ventilation. Fires were common, and collapses were feared. Families crowded into single rooms, sometimes sharing space with neighbors or relatives. Water was not always available inside these buildings. Many residents fetched water from public fountains, carrying heavy jars up flights of stairs. Waste disposal was primitive, and the smell of daily life lingered constantly. Privacy was rare, noise was constant. Yet within these walls, families cooked, slept, argued, laughed, and survived. Despite hardship, Romans found small comforts wherever they could. Food, though simple, was deeply valued. Bread was the foundation of every meal. It was eaten with olives, cheese, beans, or porridge. Meat was rare for the poor, usually reserved for festivals or special occasions. Wine, however, was common. Even children drank it, though it was watered down. Taverns dotted the city, offering cheap food, drink, and company. These spaces were loud and lively, filled with dice games, gossip, and laughter. For a short while, worries could be forgotten. Community mattered. Neighbors relied on one another for support, sharing food, news, and protection. Religious rituals, festivals, and public games gave people moments of escape. On festival days, the city transformed. Streets filled with music, incense, and processions. Temples overflowed with worshippers seeking favor from the gods. Religion was woven into daily life. Ordinary Romans prayed often, not in grand ceremonies, but in quiet moments. They prayed for health, for work, for safe childbirth, for protection from fire or illness. Small household shrines honored family spirits, offering a sense of continuity and hope. Slavery was an unavoidable part of this world. Many households owned slaves, even modest ones. Slaves worked alongside free citizens, performing similar tasks but without freedom or security. Their lives depended entirely on their owners. Some were treated kindly, others suffered harsh punishment. Freedom was possible, but never guaranteed. For women, daily life was demanding and largely invisible. They managed households, prepared food, raised children, and often assisted in family businesses. Poor women worked just as hard as men, selling goods, weaving cloth, or serving in taverns. Their labor was essential, though rarely recognized. Children grew up quickly. From a young age, they helped with chores or learned trades. Formal education was limited for the poor. Survival mattered more than schooling. Play existed, but responsibility came early. Childhood was brief. Health was fragile. Medical knowledge was limited, and treatment depended on herbs, prayers, or crude surgery. Disease spread easily in crowded conditions. Many did not live long lives. Death was familiar, present in every neighborhood, every family. Yet Romans were resilient. They adapted. They endured. They found meaning in routine and community. They laughed, argued, celebrated, and mourned together. Life was hard, but it was lived fully. At night, the city softened, work ended, lamps flickered in windows, voices lowered, the noise faded into distant murmurs, families gathered to eat, talk, and rest. Tomorrow will bring the same struggles, but also the same chances. This was the reality of ordinary Roman life, not marble statues and triumphs, but sweat, noise, hope, and endurance, a world built not only by emperors, but by millions of unnamed people who carried Rome forward day by day. As time passed, the body slowed, and the work that once defined daily life became harder to perform. Aging in ancient Rome was not gentle, especially for the poor. There were no pensions, no guaranteed care, and no certainty that family members would be able to provide support. Old age was respected in words, but survival still depended on usefulness. Many elderly Romans continued working for as long as their strength allowed. A craftsman might take on fewer tasks, a shopkeeper might rely on children or apprentices, and a laborer might shift to lighter work if possible. Those who could no longer contribute often relied on family, neighbors, or charity. Family bonds mattered deeply in this stage of life. Multi-generational households were common, especially among the poor. Grandparents shared stories, watched children, and helped where they could. In return, they received food, shelter, and a sense of belonging. Still, not everyone was so fortunate. Some elderly people lived alone, vulnerable to hunger and illness. Death was never far from daily life in Rome. Disease, accidents, fires, and poor sanitation meant that many died young. Infant mortality was high, and few families escaped loss. Because death was so common, Romans learned to live alongside it rather than deny it. When death occurred, rituals followed quickly. For ordinary Romans, funerals were modest but meaningful. The body was washed, dressed, and displayed briefly so loved ones could say farewell. Professional mourners were rare for the poor, but family members expressed grief openly, weeping and embracing the deceased. Burial practices varied depending on wealth. The wealthy built grand tombs along roads leading out of the city, hoping their names would be remembered by passers-by. Ordinary people were buried in simple graves or placed in communal tombs. Some families could afford small inscriptions, preserving a name, an age, or a brief message of love. These inscriptions often revealed the emotional depth of Roman families. Many spoke of devotion, kindness, and shared hardship. They reminded the living that ordinary lives mattered. Even without glory or fame, people were remembered by those who loved them. Religion played a comforting role in death. Romans believed in an afterlife shaped by tradition rather than strict doctrine. Spirits of the dead were honored during festivals, believed to linger near their families. Household rituals kept memory alive, connecting the living and the dead. The idea of legacy mattered, even for the poor. Legacy did not mean monuments or power, but children who survived, skills passed on, and stories remembered. A father taught his trade to a son, a mother passed down recipes and household customs. These small acts ensured continuity. Time moved forward quietly, seasons changed, festivals returned each year. Children grew, aged, and took on the same responsibilities as their parents. Rome remained vast and powerful, but for ordinary people, life continued in familiar patterns. Despite hardship, there was pride in endurance. To survive Rome was an achievement in itself. To raise children, maintain friendships, and contribute to community life was considered meaningful. Roman writers often praised simple virtues, loyalty, diligence, modesty, and resilience, qualities found abundantly among the common people. Moments of peace existed, sitting in the shade after a long day, sharing bread and wine with family, watching children play in the street, listening to distant sounds of the city settling into night. These moments gave life balance. The city itself felt alive, even as empires rose and fell. Rome's streets carried the same footsteps for generations. Ordinary Romans shaped the city through their presence, their labor, and their persistence. They were the ones who cooked the food, built the walls, cleaned the streets, and filled the markets. History rarely speaks their names. Records focus on emperors, generals, and senators. Yet Rome could not have existed without its ordinary people. They were the true foundation of the empire, holding it together through daily effort rather than dramatic action. When night came, oil lamps flickered softly across the city. The noise faded, conversations grew quieter, families rested, knowing tomorrow would demand the same strength as today. Sleep offered brief escape and renewal. In these quiet hours, life felt simple and human. The worries of power and conquest seemed distant. What remained were basic needs: warmth, food, companionship, and rest. These needs connected Romans across class and time. Centuries later, their world has vanished, but their experiences remain familiar. Work, love, fear, hope, and loss are timeless. Ordinary Romans lived lives shaped by constraint, yet filled with meaning in small ways. Their stories remind us that history is not only built by great events, but by countless ordinary days lived by ordinary people. Rome's true legacy lies not only in ruins and texts, but in the shared humanity of those who walked its streets, carried its burdens, and found moments of peace beneath its sky. And so, as the city rests, and the lamps dim, the echoes of those lives remain, quiet, enduring, and deeply human. Even within hardship, ordinary Romans found ways to escape, to breathe, and to feel joy. Life could not be all labor and worry. Without these small moments of relief, survival itself would have felt unbearable. Entertainment, in its many forms, became a vital part of everyday existence, offering distraction, connection, and meaning. Public entertainment was one of the few things that truly belonged to everyone. The games, festivals, and performances were not reserved only for the elite. They were designed to draw in the masses, to keep spirits lifted and social order maintained. For ordinary Romans, these events were moments when life felt larger than daily struggle. The most famous of these spectacles took place in amphitheaters. Gladiatorial games were brutal, but they were also deeply ritualized. To the crowd, they were displays of courage, endurance, and fate. Ordinary people filled the stone seats, cheering, gasping, and reacting as one body. For a few hours, worries about food, rent, or illness faded into the background, yet entertainment was not only found in grand arenas. Theaters hosted plays and comedies that reflected everyday life. These performances were loud, expressive, and often humorous, poking fun at social roles, relationships, and human weakness. Ordinary Romans laughed at exaggerated versions of themselves, finding comfort in shared experience. Music was everywhere. Musicians played in streets, taverns, and public gatherings. Simple instruments, flutes, drums, stringed instruments, accompanied festivals and private celebrations. Music marked weddings, religious rituals, and moments of mourning. It helped express emotions that words could not. Children played games in alleyways and courtyards. They chased hoops, tossed knucklebones, and invented their own amusements. Toys were simple, often handmade, but play itself was universal. Even in a city filled with danger, laughter could still be heard. Storytelling was another escape. Stories passed from mouth to mouth, tales of gods, heroes, ghosts, and strange happenings. Ordinary Romans loved stories of mystery and wonder. These tales entertained, frightened, and taught lessons about fate, morality, and the unknown. Taverns remained central to social life. They were places where workers gathered after long days, sharing food and drink. Conversations flowed easily, news spread quickly, friendships formed, arguments erupted and faded just as fast. For many, the tavern was the heart of community life. Food itself was a form of comfort. While meals were simple, they were shared. A bowl of porridge eaten together felt different from one eaten alone. Special days brought special foods, sweet pastries, honeyed treats, roasted meat. These moments were remembered long after the meal ended. Festivals transformed the city. Streets were decorated, processions wound through neighborhoods, incense filled the air, gods were honored with offerings, prayers, and celebration. Ordinary Romans dressed in their best clothing, even if it was worn and patched. For a day, life felt lighter. Religion offered hope beyond entertainment. Temples welcomed worshippers seeking reassurance. Prayers were whispered, candles lit, vows made. People asked for protection, forgiveness, and guidance. Belief gave meaning to suffering and structure to uncertainty. Even nature offered brief relief. Sitting near fountains, gardens, or shaded porticos allowed people to rest. The sound of flowing water softened the noise of the city. These quiet spaces were precious, especially in crowded neighborhoods. Love existed within these moments. Romantic relationships were shaped by social rules, but affection found ways to express itself. Letters, glances, shared meals, and quiet meetings sustained bonds. Family love was constant, Even under strain, humor played a powerful role. Jokes, insults, and playful teasing filled daily interactions. Romans appreciated wit and sarcasm. Laughter relieved tension and reinforced social bonds. To laugh together was to survive together. Even superstition became a form of comfort. Amulets were worn for protection. Omens were interpreted carefully. Small rituals helped people feel some control over unpredictable lives. These beliefs filled the gaps where certainty was lacking. As night approached, entertainment shifted. Lamps glowed in taverns. Music softened. Conversations grew more intimate. Some returned home early, exhausted. Others lingered, savoring the freedom of the evening. These moments mattered deeply. They reminded ordinary Romans that life was more than survival, that joy, however fleeting, was worth seeking, that even in a vast and demanding empire, individual lives held meaning. Entertainment did not erase hardship, but it balanced it. It offered relief without denying reality. It created shared experiences that united people across class and circumstance. Through laughter, music, ritual, and rest, ordinary Romans reclaimed parts of themselves each day. These small escapes sustained them. They allowed hope to survive alongside hardship. Life in Rome unfolded under the constant presence of law and authority, yet for ordinary people, justice was uneven and often unpredictable. Laws existed in great number, carved into stone and written into scrolls, but how those laws were applied depended heavily on status, wealth, and influence. For the poor, the law was something to be wary of rather than trusted. The streets of Rome were busy, crowded, and often dangerous. With so many people packed tightly together, conflicts were unavoidable. Arguments erupted over space, money, insults, or misunderstandings. A careless word could escalate into violence. Knives were common tools, easily turned into weapons when tempers flared. There was no modern police force. Instead, order was maintained by a mix of magistrates, guards, and eventually night watchmen. During the day, officials relied on authority and reputation. At night, patrols moved cautiously through the streets, carrying lanterns and watching for fires, thieves, or unrest. Fire was one of the greatest fears. With wooden beams, open flames, and crowded buildings, a single spark could destroy entire neighborhoods. Ordinary Romans slept lightly, listening for shouts or alarms. Buckets of water were kept nearby. Everyone knew how quickly disaster could spread. Crime existed at every level. Pickpockets blended easily into crowds. Burglars targeted homes after dark. Gangs sometimes controlled neighborhoods, offering protection in exchange for loyalty or payment. Ordinary citizens learned to recognize danger and avoid trouble whenever possible. Punishment was harsh and public. Executions, floggings, and forced labor served as warnings to others. Justice was meant to be seen. For the poor, a single accusation could ruin a life. Wealthy Romans could often avoid punishment through influence, but ordinary people had little defense. Despite this, many Romans believed deeply in order and tradition. The idea of law, even imperfectly applied, gave structure to society. Courts existed, trials were held, witnesses spoke. Some justice was achieved, though rarely evenly. Contracts mattered. Even simple agreements carried weight. A handshake could represent obligation. Trust was essential in a city where survival depended on cooperation. Breaking trust damaged reputation, and reputation was everything. Social pressure played a powerful role in maintaining order. Neighbors watched one another. Gossip traveled fast. A person known for dishonesty or violence found doors closing quickly. Community judgment often mattered more than official punishment. Slaves lived under constant legal vulnerability. They had no rights of their own. Their bodies belonged to their owners. A slave could be punished severely for minor offenses. Yet even within this system, informal relationships developed. Some masters showed restraint. Some slaves earned trust, responsibilities, or eventual freedom. Fear was part of daily life, but it did not dominate it completely. Romans adapted. They learned when to speak and when to stay silent. They chose battles carefully. Survival required awareness, patience, and restraint. Public spaces offered some protection. Markets, forums, and baths were safer because of numbers. Violence was less likely in full view of others. These spaces allowed ordinary people to feel momentarily secure. The baths, especially, were places where social boundaries softened. Rich and poor shared the same water, if not the same status. Conversations flowed easily. News spread. Complaints were voiced. For a time, the pressures of the street eased. Religion also offered reassurance. Temples promised divine order even when human justice failed. People prayed for protection, fairness, and peace. Rituals gave a sense that chaos could be managed, if not eliminated. Children learned early how to navigate danger. Parents warned them about certain streets, strangers, and behaviors. Survival skills were passed down quietly, through experience rather than instruction. Nightfall changed the city. Shadows deepened, lamps flickered, sounds carried farther. Many avoided travel after dark unless necessary. Those who worked nights moved cautiously, alert to every movement. Despite these dangers, Rome did not descend into constant chaos. The city functioned because ordinary people cooperated, adapted, and endured. Order was fragile but persistent. Even in fear, life continued. Shops opened, goods were sold, families gathered, celebrations occurred, weddings were held, children were born, death was mourned. Fear existed alongside routine, not instead of it. This balance defined Roman life. Danger was real, but it did not erase humanity. Ordinary people navigated uncertainty with quiet strength. They found ways to live fully within constraints. Law, fear, and survival shaped their world, but they did not define it entirely. Beneath the threat of punishment and disorder lay resilience, cooperation, and shared understanding. For ordinary Romans, the world did not end at what could be seen or touched. Invisible forces shaped daily life just as strongly as hunger, labor, or law. Gods, spirits, omens, and fate were woven into every routine, every decision, every fear. Religion was not distant or abstract. It lived inside homes, streets, and even thoughts. Most Romans did not question whether the gods existed. The question was whether the gods were satisfied. In nearly every household, no matter how small or poor, there was a shrine. It might be nothing more than a small niche in the wall, holding figurines of household gods, the Lares and Penates. These spirits were believed to guard a family, the home, and daily activities. Food, wine, or incense was offered to them regularly, sometimes daily. Before eating, a small portion of food might be set aside for the gods. Before leaving the house, a brief prayer could be whispered. These acts were simple but meaningful. They were ways of maintaining balance with the unseen world. Failure to honor the gods was dangerous. Misfortune was often interpreted as punishment or neglect. A failed business, an illness, or an accident could signal divine displeasure. Ordinary Romans did not think in terms of coincidence. Everything had meaning. Public religion filled a city. Temples dominated skylines. Festivals filled calendars. Processions moved through streets, carrying statues of gods, accompanied by music, chanting, and offerings. Even the poorest citizens participated, at least as observers. Sacrifice was central. Animals were offered to gods in exchange for favor. The smoke rising from altars carried prayers upward. The condition of the sacrificed animal, the color of its organs, the flow of blood, was carefully examined for signs. Priests interpreted these details, guiding decisions large and small. Superstition blended seamlessly with formal religion. Amulets were worn to ward off evil. Charms were hung over doors. Certain words were avoided. Certain days were considered unlucky. Sneezes, dreams, or unexpected sounds could carry warnings. The fear of the evil eye was widespread. Envy was believed to bring harm. People protected themselves with symbols, gestures, or talismans. Children, especially, were thought to be vulnerable. Mothers tied charms around their necks to guard them. Magic existed alongside religion, though officially frowned upon. Love spells, curses, and healing charms circulated quietly. Some sought to influence outcomes through whispered incantations or written tablets buried in secret places. These practices were risky but tempting. Illness was often spiritual before it was physical. A sickness might be blamed on offended gods, restless spirits, or malevolent magic. Healing involved prayer, offerings, and sometimes pilgrimage to temples associated with specific cures. Death deepened belief. The boundary between the living and the dead felt thin. Spirits of ancestors were honored to prevent unrest. Improper burial was feared, as restless souls could wander and cause harm. Funerals were serious, ritual-heavy events. Grave markers carried warnings and blessings alike. Tombs lined roads outside the city, reminding travelers of mortality. Ordinary Romans passed these graves daily, aware that death was close, inevitable, and meaningful. Fate held immense power. Many believed destiny was fixed, yet influenced by divine will. Astrology guided decisions. Horoscopes were consulted. The movement of stars mattered. Birth dates carried weight. Dreams were taken seriously. A dream could be a message from a god or a warning. Some people visited temples specifically to sleep there, hoping for divine dreams that offered guidance or healing. Despite all this belief, Roman religion was practical rather than emotional. Gods were not loved unconditionally, they were respected, negotiated with, and sometimes blamed. Relationships with gods were transactional. Offerings were given in exchange for protection. There was room for many gods. Romans readily adopted deities from conquered lands. Foreign gods entered the city, finding followers among ordinary people seeking hope, healing, or belonging. This openness allowed religious diversity. Cults formed around particular gods, offering community and purpose. Some promised salvation, others secret knowledge, others protection in the afterlife. For slaves and the poor, religion offered something rare: dignity. Before the gods, status mattered less. Anyone could pray, anyone could hope. Temples were spaces where suffering could be acknowledged, if not solved. Festivals brought relief from hardship. Work paused, food was shared, laughter filled streets. These moments allowed ordinary Romans to feel joy, unity, and escape from routine struggles. Yet fear always lingered. Omens could shift moods instantly. A bad sign could cancel plans, delay travel, or spark anxiety. Life required constant interpretation. Children absorbed belief naturally. They learned prayers alongside speech. They watched rituals and mimicked gestures. Faith was not taught formally, it was lived. As Rome grew, religion evolved. Political power emerged with divine authority. Emperors were honored as gods. Loyalty became sacred. For ordinary people, this added another layer of obligation and caution. Still, personal belief remained intimate. A whispered prayer in the dark carried as much meaning as a grand sacrifice. Faith was woven quietly into survival. In a city of uncertainty, belief provided structure. It explained suffering. It offered hope. It made sense of chaos. Even when life was harsh, the idea that unseen forces cared, or could be persuaded, mattered deeply. For ordinary Romans, the invisible world was not distant. It walked beside them, shaped their choices, and filled a silence between moments. Life in Rome was demanding, often exhausting, and sometimes cruel. For ordinary Romans, moments of leisure were not luxuries, they were necessary escapes. Entertainment offered relief from labor, distraction from worry, and shared experiences that bound communities together. Leisure did not mean rest in silence, it meant noise, movement, and spectacle. Public entertainment was woven into the rhythm of Roman life. The city itself seemed built for it. Amphitheaters, theaters, circuses, and bath complexes dominated urban space. These were not reserved for elites. Ordinary citizens filled them in massive numbers. The most famous form of entertainment was the gladiatorial games. For many Romans, these were more than violent displays, they were communal events. People gathered early, claimed seats, shouted, argued, and cheered. The atmosphere was charged. Gladiators were admired and feared. Though many were slaves or prisoners, they became celebrities. Their names were known. Their victories were remembered. Ordinary Romans followed their careers passionately, sometimes supporting favorites as modern fans support athletes. The violence was real, but it was ritualized. Death was possible, but not guaranteed. The crowd's reaction mattered. Mercy could be granted. The audience participated emotionally, deciding fate with cheers or silence. For many, the games were a reminder of power, Rome's dominance over enemies, nature, and fate. For others, they were simply thrilling distractions from daily hardship. Chariot racing was even more popular, held in massive circuses. These races drew enormous crowds. Teams were identified by colors: red, blue, green, and white. Loyalty ran deep. Supporters argued, celebrated, and sometimes fought over their chosen faction. Races were fast, dangerous, and unpredictable. Crashes were common. Drivers risked death, yet this danger heightened excitement. The roar of the crowd could be heard across the city. Unlike the games, chariot racing allowed people to identify with success. A driver could rise from obscurity to fame. For ordinary Romans, this possibility, however rare, was inspiring. Theaters offered a different escape. Comedies, tragedies, and farces filled performance schedules. Plays were lively, often crude, and designed to entertain rather than educate. Actors exaggerated gestures and voices so even those far from the stage could understand. Comedy was especially popular. It mocked daily life, marriage, politics, and human weakness. Ordinary Romans laughed at characters that resembled themselves: clever slaves, foolish masters, greedy merchants. Music accompanied many performances. Flutes, drums, and stringed instruments filled the air. Songs were catchy, repeated, and familiar. Even those who could not read or write knew popular tunes. Street performers added to the atmosphere. Jugglers, acrobats, storytellers, and musicians gathered crowds in markets and squares. Children watched wide-eyed. Adults paused briefly, enjoying moments of wonder. Games and festivals marked the calendar. Religious holidays brought days off from work. During these times, normal routines paused. People dressed differently, ate better, and socialized freely. Festivals were noisy, crowded, and joyful. Wine flowed. Food was shared. Laughter replaced anxiety, if only temporarily. Bathhouses were another center of leisure. For ordinary Romans, baths were affordable and accessible. They were not just for washing, they were social spaces. People talked, argued, rested, exercised, and relaxed. Bathing followed a routine. Warm rooms, hot pools, cold plunges. Oil was applied and scraped off. This process was cleansing and comforting. For many, it was the highlight of the day. Baths blurred social boundaries. Rich and poor shared spaces, though at different times or sections. Conversation flowed easily. News spread quickly. Gossip traveled faster than official announcements. Games were played casually. Dice, board games, and betting were common. Gambling was officially restricted but widely practiced. Coins changed hands. Arguments broke out. Laughter followed. Children played with simple toys, balls, dolls, hoops. They invented games using imagination more than equipment. Streets became playgrounds. For adults, leisure was often collective. People rarely spent free time alone. Social life was public, shared, and visible. Yet leisure did not mean equality. Seating arrangements reflected status. Clothing marked class. Some spaces were restricted. Still, moments of shared excitement created temporary unity. Even slaves experienced leisure indirectly. They watched spectacles while working. They listened to performances from outside. They absorbed the atmosphere of celebration, even if participation was limited. Leisure also served political purposes. Rulers understood its power. Free entertainment kept crowds satisfied. Bread and games were tools of control. Ordinary Romans benefited, even if unknowingly. Despite this, entertainment offered genuine relief. Life was hard. Laughter mattered. Distraction mattered. Shared joy mattered. In quieter moments, leisure became personal. Reading scrolls, listening to stories, or reflecting quietly were forms of rest for some. Philosophical ideas circulated among ordinary people, simplified and practical. Conversation itself was entertainment. Romans loved debate. They discussed politics, gossip, rumors, and philosophy passionately. Words mattered. Public spaces encouraged interaction. Streets were alive with sound. Silence was rare. Even at night, entertainment continued. Taverns filled with laughter, music, and argument. Wine loosened tongues. Songs echoed through narrow streets. Leisure was never completely safe. Crowds could turn violent. Games could provoke unrest. Yet the desire for escape outweighed fear. For ordinary Romans, entertainment was not separate from life. It was part of survival. It provided balance, meaning, and relief. In a world filled with labor, uncertainty, and strict hierarchy, moments of shared excitement reminded people that joy still existed. These moments did not erase hardship, but they softened it, and sometimes, that was enough. Death was never distant in the Roman world. For ordinary Romans, it was a constant presence, seen in the streets, felt in the home, and expected as part of life. Illness, accidents, childbirth, and violence meant that many people encountered death early and often. Yet death was not hidden. It was faced openly. When someone died, the household responded immediately. The body was washed, anointed with oils, and dressed. Family members gathered. Neighbors came to pay respects. Mourning began at once. Death was not private. It was communal. The deceased was usually displayed in the home for a short time. This allowed friends and relatives to say goodbye. Lamps burned, incense filled the room, quiet conversations replaced normal noise. Professional mourners were sometimes hired, even by modest families. Their cries and gestures made grief visible. Public mourning showed that a life had value. Funeral processions moved through the streets. The body was carried on a bier, followed by family, friends, and sometimes musicians. Ordinary Romans paused their work as the procession passed. Death demanded acknowledgement. Burial practices varied. Some families buried their dead in simple graves outside the city. Others cremated bodies and placed ashes in urns. Both methods were common. Tombs lined Roman roads. Travelers walked among the dead daily. Inscriptions spoke directly to passers-by. Names, ages, professions, and brief messages were carved into stone. Many inscriptions were simple. They recorded short lives, children, young adults, parents lost too early. These stones were not grand monuments. They were acts of remembrance. Ordinary Romans believed that being remembered mattered deeply. Memory was a form of survival. To be forgotten was a second death. Epitaphs often spoke in the first person. The dead addressed the living. They reminded readers to enjoy life, to pause, to remember that time was limited. Death rituals were shaped by religion and tradition. Romans believed that proper burial was essential. Without it, the soul could not rest. Families made offerings to the dead. Food, wine, and flowers were placed at graves. Certain days were set aside to honor ancestors. These rituals connected generations. The dead were not feared, they were respected. Yet fear still existed. Spirits were believed to linger if neglected. Night was associated with the unseen. Stories of restless souls circulated quietly. Despite this, death was accepted as natural. Grief was real, but denial was rare. Life and death were understood as inseparable. Children were introduced to death early. They attended funerals. They saw graves. They learned that life was fragile. This awareness shaped Roman attitudes. Urgency existed alongside routine. People worked hard, celebrated fiercely, and argued passionately, knowing time was uncertain. For the poor, death could be sudden and unnoticed. Many died without markers or formal rites. Still, communities remembered them in smaller ways, through stories, shared memories, and quiet acknowledgement. Slaves often received minimal burial. Some masters provided rites, others did not. Even so, slave communities created their own forms of remembrance. Death also reinforced hierarchy. Tomb size, location, and inscription reflected status. Yet even the humblest marker represented dignity. Life expectancy was low by modern standards. Reaching old age was rare and respected. Elders were valued for experience and memory. Those who survived hardship carried visible signs of age, scars, injuries, loss. Their continued existence was seen as resilience. Philosophical ideas about death circulated among ordinary people. Simplified teachings emphasized acceptance. Death was not evil, it was inevitable. Some found comfort in belief, others relied on family bonds. Many simply continued living without deep reflection. Death shaped daily choices. People valued companionship. They avoided isolation. Social life mattered because it could end suddenly. In times of plague or disaster, death became overwhelming. Mass burials replaced individual rites. Fear spread quickly, yet even then, people sought meaning. Ordinary Romans responded to loss with rituals, repetition, and memory. They returned to work. They honored the dead. Life continued. Grief was not rushed, but it was expected to end. Excessive mourning was discouraged. Balance was valued. Death was not the end of community, it reinforced it. Inscriptions often ended with simple words, farewell. This was not dramatic, it was honest. The dead did not vanish from Roman life. They remained present in stories, names, and traditions. Family lines mattered. Ancestors were remembered not as distant figures, but as known individuals. Even centuries later, their words remain carved in stone. For ordinary Romans, death was not something to defeat. It was something to face with dignity. Life was brief, memory endured, and in that memory, ordinary lives found meaning beyond their final breath.